Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The first time Evelyn paid rent without Martin's knowledge, she justified it to herself like a mother hiding vegetables inside a child's favorite stew. Necessary, even if unappreciated. The landlord had come knocking, his face wearing the worry of unpaid months. Martin had just stepped out, leaving behind the scent of freshly sprayed perfume and a promise that rent was in motion. But Evelyn knew better. She had seen the same script unfold like a worn-out Nollywood drama. No deposit, no receipt, just words stacked like chairs at a party that never happened. So she quietly walked to the bank, withdrew part of her fixed savings, and paid. She didn't tell him. Not out of fear, but fatigue. What was the use of repeating conversations that evaporated like mist in sunlight? Her friends would call her a pillar. Her mother would call her too patient. But deep down, Evelyn felt like a house standing through a storm, without knowing when her own roof might cave in. In those early days, love had been a sweet scent in the air, one you couldn't see but swore you felt. They had danced and borrowed joy, shared dreams, as if their future was something they both held like a baby between them. But somewhere along the line, Evelyn realized she had become the only one rocking the cradle. Martin had never been a bad man, just a man who mastered the art of lounging inside comfort zones others built for him. When they got married, he was fresh out of a contract job, full of hope and stories that sounded like plans but floated like clouds. Evelyn, ever the optimist, filled in the gaps. She offered her ATM card like a handshake. She bought the curtains, the sofa, even their first television set. When their first child came, she paid for the hospital bills while Martin told everyone he had handled everything. She never argued. She let him have his trophy, even though she'd bought it. But love, when stretched too thin, begins to sound like silence. With each passing month, Evelyn noticed Martin's contribution to the home shrinking like fabric in hot water. A missed school fee here, a forgotten grocery list there, until one day she looked at their monthly budget and found herself listed under both breadwinner and housekeeper. She laughed, quietly, bitterly. Not because it was funny, but because her tears had clocked out from the same job long ago. She once asked Martin why he wasn't sending money for groceries anymore, and he said, "You handle money better than I do." She blinked. That sentence wasn't a compliment. It was a resignation letter dressed as praise. It wasn't just the finances that wore her thin. It was the subtle entitlement wrapped inside Martin's carefree stride. He would scroll his phone lazily on the couch while she ran up and down packing school lunch. He would joke about her overworking herself, as if the exhaustion was some badge she begged to wear. He once laughed and said, "Babe, you be like engine way no day tire," and she smiled because sarcasm had become the last language they spoke fluently. There were nights she lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was what she signed up for or what she had gradually grown into without realizing. Martin's family praised her. But strength wasn't supposed to feel like suffocation. She wasn't asking for the moon, just partnership, a kind of shared weight. She needed a co-pilot, not another passenger. Her friends called it modern marriage. Evelyn called it emotional debt collection. And Martin, he called it understanding. He once said, "Evelyn, be calming down. Things will pick up." But she was no longer holding her breath for promises that came like rain clouds, dark, dramatic, and passing without a single drop. Still, Evelyn kept the home spinning. Not because she was a saint, but because she had invested too much to let it crumble without a fight. Their second child came, and she was back in the labor room alone. Martin had traveled for a job opportunity. He sent a voice note, "Hope the delivery goes smoothly. Keep me posted." She played it between contractions and wondered how love could go from handwritten letters to lazy audio messages. After the birth, Martin showed up with a small cake and balloons, posing for Instagram stories like a doting father. Evelyn smiled for the camera, but behind the filter was a woman bleeding from places no midwife could stitch. Her sister, Anita, noticed the change. "You look dim," she said one Sunday afternoon. Evelyn replied, "I'm just tired." But tired was an understatement. She was running on fumes, emotionally bankrupt yet expected to keep the lights on. Sometimes she wondered if Martin even saw her anymore or just the benefits of having her around. She no longer asked for help. She made lists. She no longer cried. She scheduled rest. And at night, when the world slept, she would stare at her bank app not to check the balance, but to count how many more months she could carry a man who no longer noticed her shoulder bruised from lifting both of them. It started with silence, not the kind that comes when words run out, but the type that settles in like damp air after rainfall, thick and unwilling to leave. Evelyn had learned how to carry tension in her back like a backpack she couldn't drop, moving through the house like a ghost with a purpose. Martin, for all his jokes and selective memory, didn't fail to notice the change. The woman who once rushed to pick up his clothes before he said a word now walked past them like they were museum pieces on display. Breakfasts were no longer served with soft hums of gospel tunes. Instead, the kitchen echoed with clanging spoons and unsaid things. The air grew heavy between them. But even in that discomfort, Martin found ways to rationalize it. "She's just stressed," he told himself. "She'll come around." But Evelyn had passed the roundabout of hope long ago. What remained now was a straight road toward emotional detachment, and she was already halfway down. She didn't stop caring overnight, but caring had become too expensive, and she was tired of paying in advance for someone else's comfort. He once asked her why there was no milk in the fridge, and she replied without looking up, "I thought you were going to get it this time." He laughed awkwardly, but Evelyn didn't flinch. Her voice didn't crack. She had finally made room for the absence he kept serving. Martin, on his part, tried to keep up appearances. When his cousin Victor visited from out of town, he told stories of being too busy with logistics and managing several unnamed deals. He wore his ambition like a fancy jacket, forgetting that it had no lining on the inside. Meanwhile, Evelyn cooked, served, smiled, and washed dishes with hands that remembered every unpaid bill and every ignored message about the children's fees. She wasn't confrontational by nature, but quiet women don't mean clueless. Sometimes silence is just a louder scream that no one bothers to translate. She watched Martin boast and nod along, but inside she was peeling off the last bits of illusion she'd held on to. The day the school sent a reminder about overdue fees, she didn't panic. She forwarded the email to Martin's phone without a single word. Hours passed. He didn't respond. The next morning, she dressed the kids, kissed their foreheads, and whispered, "Daddy's going to pay today." That night, when he returned, she asked him how the payment went. He blinked, stuttered. "Niet. Listen about setting things is a change Kyonzara. For you know the to Kumaglef coded as to beats. You see the bangs the best never things spinning. Return as near baiting to dive in your next odds, worth tax legs and that kind of left in your thing. Often thank you for Shunivi Matara, will lay in your sex of. Oh, was if you see make him. You ace is being in Lexmouth and whether it's at a better escalates of fresh bangs and stashed it, and wanda, the face and a child. She smiled. "I called the school. Just wanted to thank you myself," she said, locking eyes with him. That was the moment Martin realized the rules had changed. Evelyn was no longer waiting for him to show up. She had left the door open, but not to let him in, only to let the air breathe. They began to orbit each other like two planets with their own gravity. Meals became quiet. Schedules clashed without effort. Martin started returning home later, his excuses stitched with vague words like clients, delays, and network issues. Evelyn never argued. She just noted the patterns, marking emotional absences like someone counting lost teeth. Her patience no longer came from love, it came from survival. She knew if she fought him, he'd twist it into disrespect. If she begged him, he'd see it as dependence. So she chose the middle lane, the lane of intentional withdrawal. Not dramatic, not cold, just absent in the ways that mattered. When the rent renewal notice came again, she folded it and placed it on Martin's side of the bed. He picked it up, stared at it for minutes, then left it on the bedside drawer for 2 weeks. On the 15th day, Evelyn came home early, saw it still sitting there, and laughed, a deep, quiet laugh that came from the belly of realization. This wasn't forgetfulness, it was comfort. He had grown comfortable living like a tenant in a house she funded, and she had allowed it until now. The day Evelyn stopped buying groceries was the day Martin truly noticed what he'd been eating off. He opened the fridge one evening to find only a bowl of water and some leftover stew. "Where's the food?" he asked. Evelyn looked up from her laptop, said didn't feel like shopping, and returned to typing. He was stunned. She had never said that before. She, who would rush to fill the house like a seasoned homemaker, now sat back and let lack walk in like an old visitor. The next morning, the children asked for their usual lunch snack, and Evelyn replied, "Ask Daddy." They did. Martin promised. He forgot. The teacher called Evelyn that afternoon to say the kids were hungry. She sighed, not with anger, but with the weight of too many repeated scripts. That night, she packed her own meal and left Martin with an empty pot and a silent house. He walked around the living room like a man searching for something he'd misplaced. But the truth was simple. He hadn't lost Evelyn. He just stopped earning her. And now, as the light dimmed across the house, and the echo of responsibility bounced off the walls he had refused to hold up, Martin finally began to hear the silence Evelyn had been speaking in all along. Evelyn didn't announce her decision to stop playing the financier of the household. She simply let it unfold like the quiet withdrawal of a tide. At first, Martin tried to wait her out, believing her change in rhythm was just one of those feminine moods that passed like the wind. But days turned into weeks, and the rhythm remained consistent, steady and quiet, like a clock that had chosen not to chime anymore. The water bills remained unpaid, and the electricity token ran out one sticky Thursday night. Martin lit a candle and waited for Evelyn to rise from the couch and fix it. She didn't. Instead, she poured herself a glass of cold Zobo from a flask she tucked in the children's room and quietly scrolled her phone. The candle flickered beside him, casting shadows on the walls that looked like reminders of responsibilities he had failed to carry. That night, he slept sweating beside a woman whose peace was louder than his pride. In the morning, when he mumbled about the dark night, Evelyn replied, "It gets darker when one person stops shining all the light." The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a decade of silent sacrifices. Martin started noticing things in a way he never had before. How the groceries didn't replenish. How the kids started referring to Evelyn's decisions as final without consulting him. How even the house smelled more of eucalyptus oil and less of his cologne. It wasn't rebellion. Evelyn had simply reclaimed her energy. And she did it with the grace of a woman who had counted the cost and decided she was done paying with her blood. One Sunday morning, as Martin stood before his wardrobe complaining about his missing socks, Evelyn looked up from her journal and said, "If I've become your house help, then the salary is long overdue." He chuckled, assuming it was a joke. But her eyes were stone still, like a sea before a storm. That was the first time he realized he might actually lose her, not to another man, but to herself. And that kind of loss was more painful. For the first time since their wedding, Martin cooked rice. It burned. The children laughed. Evelyn didn't. She didn't mock, didn't cheer, just observed. Because when a woman has been mother, breadwinner, cleaner, cook, nurse, and emotional dumping ground, she eventually runs out of roles to play. And Evelyn had reached curtain call. The shift in the home was no longer subtle. It had grown arms and started moving furniture. Martin became edgy, easily irritable, making snide remarks about how Evelyn had changed. But change was inevitable when one was constantly forced to stretch without rest. Evelyn had stopped asking where he went at night or who he spent his idle hours with. She had also stopped checking the children's homework with him. She did it alone, created bedtime stories, and even opened a small savings account for them without mentioning it. Her mind was no longer fixated on repairing what clearly wanted to remain broken. The day Martin came back to find her working on a proposal at midnight, he asked, "Don't you sleep anymore?" And she replied, "Sleep is for the safe." He didn't understand, but it wasn't for him to understand anymore. Her phone rang. She answered. It was her colleague Felix, calling about a pending report. Martin raised an eyebrow, trying to pick a fight. But Evelyn, calm as a quiet brook, ended the call and asked, "Is jealousy the only thing you are still capable of contributing?" His lips parted, but no words came out. He was standing on the very rug he had pulled from under her feet years ago, and now it was being tugged from his. Suspicion, once planted, grew like weeds in Martin's chest. He began checking her WhatsApp messages when she left her phone on the couch, reading conversations that were mostly work-related but still made his insecurities itch. He started showing up at her office unannounced, pretending he was in the area, just to see if another man had replaced his absence. But no man had. Only Evelyn had replaced her old self with someone wiser. She no longer flinched when he raised his voice. She no longer softened when he pouted. She had shed that skin, the one stitched with guilt and stitched tighter with obligation. The neighbors started whispering. "Evelyn looks different these days, lighter," one said. "Martin no day see road again," another added. But Evelyn didn't entertain gossip. Her focus was now on building something that didn't require her constantly bleeding to prove she cared. She started taking the kids to church alone, smiling as they skipped ahead of her. She greeted Martin when she returned, but her tone was no longer the soft cotton it once was. It had turned to linen, strong, crisp, and impossible to wrinkle under anyone's weight again. That week, when she sat in bed and read a novel while Martin grumbled about the generator, she whispered to herself, "Peace is expensive, and I've paid the price in full." The day Evelyn refused to send the house rent, Martin realized too late that comfort is a thief with soft feet. It never knocks before it empties the pantry. For years, he had grown into the illusion that Evelyn's wallet was their family's insurance policy, like a magic pot that refilled itself regardless of storms. The rent renewal notice sat untouched on the living room shelf, gathering dust beside unopened letters and broken promises. Martin stepped over it for 3 days, half expecting Evelyn to quietly handle it the way she always had. But nothing happened. No receipts, no whisper of "I've sorted it," not even a sigh of stress. Instead, Evelyn dressed the children for school, ironed her clothes with methodical calm, and walked out the front door without so much as a glance at the landlord's letter. When Martin asked, "Are we not going to talk about the rent?" she replied, "We are not." Her words were bricks, dry, blunt, and final. That evening, the landlord knocked. Martin opened the door, trying to appear collected, but the sweat beneath his armpits betrayed him. "Mr. Martin," the landlord said, "I'll need full payment before the week ends, or I'll have to involve the lawyers." Martin nodded, closed the door, and stood in the hallway, his ears ringing from a silence that now demanded rent in full. Martin sat on the edge of their bed that night, flipping through his phone as if money would magically text him. He checked his account balance again. The numbers stared back, unimpressed. The friends he once bought beer for now left his messages on read. He paced the room, half expecting Evelyn to say something, maybe an offer to help this last time. But she didn't. She brushed her hair, lotioned her legs, and laid beside him like peace itself had become her skin. When he finally spoke, "Are you really just going to let us get kicked out?" She turned to him, voice calm but razor sharp, and said, "You've been letting us down for years. This time, I'm just following your lead." That night, Martin didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling while Evelyn drifted off with a fan humming above her like a lullaby. The next morning, he called his older brother for a loan. The man laughed on the phone and said, "I warned you not to marry and relax like a retired politician." By the third day, with no help coming, Martin began to crumble from the inside out. Pride is a meal that looks rich until it leaves you starving, and Martin was now chewing on the bones of his own ego. It wasn't just the rent. Everything else had begun to show cracks. The children stopped asking Martin for things. His daughter, Amira, now 6, once held up her drawing and ran to show Evelyn only. When Martin tried to get involved, the little girl smiled politely and said, "Mummy always has time." That sentence was a spear to his gut. Evelyn had, without noise, become the sun round which the home revolved, while Martin had turned into a shadow that showed up but didn't warm the room. He noticed how the children leaned into Evelyn's shoulder during movies, how they called her at work just to say hi, how they remembered that she, not he, always fixed their broken toys and ironed their uniforms. The home had become a garden, and she was the one watering it daily. Martin was just there, like a bench, occasionally used, mostly ignored. One Sunday, he stayed home while Evelyn and the kids went to church. He stood by the window, watching them leave, her heels clicking with confidence, the kids holding her hands as if she were both parent and superhero. That morning, Martin saw something terrifying. He wasn't missed. No one looked back. No one waved. He was becoming a background character in a house where he once claimed to be king. The straw that finally cracked Martin's delusion was subtle, like most defining moments. Evelyn had a flat tire one Monday afternoon while picking up the children. She called him, not out of need, but respect. Martin picked the call, distracted, and said he'd call back. He didn't. 3 hours later, he strolled into the compound to see a mechanic pumping the spare tire while Evelyn handed him a cold drink and cash for his time. "Don't worry, Olga," the mechanic joked to Martin. "You're Madam Not Correct Woman." Martin smiled weakly, his chest tight. That night, after the kids had slept, he turned to Evelyn and whispered, "You're pulling away from me." She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable, then replied, "I stopped pushing for us because I realized I was the only one on the hill." Martin didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. For years, he had stretched her loyalty like chewing gum, thin, messy, and eventually tasteless. Now, all that was left was the echo of her footsteps reclaiming every room he once took for granted. She no longer raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her calm was now the loudest thunder in their home, and Martin was finally hearing it for the first time. The morning Martin packed a small duffel bag and left the house, Evelyn didn't blink. He didn't slam the door, didn't shout, didn't leave a dramatic note pinned to the mirror. He just left, like mist disappearing with the first kiss of sunlight. He claimed he needed space, a breather, some time to clear his head, as if the fog was outside the house and not thick inside his own mind. Evelyn watched him from the bedroom window, not with anger, but with an emptiness that had learned how to breathe. She made no calls, no texts, no inquiries. She simply folded the laundry, prepared breakfast for the children, and moved her chair slightly closer to the window where the morning sun spilled in. Her silence was not revenge, it was recovery. For the first time in a long time, the house felt light. The absence of expectation was a kind of music, and Evelyn let it play. Martin had gone to his friend Desmond's house, hoping for empathy, maybe even validation. But by the third day, the welcome mat had started curling at the edges. Desmond had bills too, a family too, and no space for a grown man running from responsibilities he once called his crown. So Martin became a burden wearing cologne, polite, but still a burden. By the second week, Martin's pride had thinned like a shirt that had seen too many wash cycles. He spent most days indoors, lying on Desmond's couch, scrolling through photos of his family like a stranger peeking into a life that had moved on without him. Evelyn, on the other hand, was adapting, She fixed the front gate that had squeaked for months, paid the NEPA token, renewed the internet subscription, and even found time to teach her daughter how to fry puff puff. The house was no longer a stage where she waited for a co-star to remember his lines. It had become a studio of peace where every corner reflected her strength. Neighbors noticed she smiled more, wore brighter wrappers, even laughed, full belly laughter that had been locked in the prison of pretense for too long. One Saturday, she attended a community women's seminar on financial independence and spoke briefly about the importance of boundaries. She didn't mention Martin, but everyone listening knew the story lived between her pauses. Her phone buzzed later that night. It was Martin, texting, "I miss you." She stared at the message, then locked her phone and went to sleep. Some nights, peace needs no reply. Silence, too, has a language. Martin finally returned home one evening just before the rain. The clouds were heavy, the breeze loud, the sky threatening to break open like a confession. He knocked, not because he didn't have a key, but because something in him knew the locks may have changed, even if only metaphorically. Evelyn opened the door slowly, her eyes as unreadable as a sealed letter. He entered with small words. "Hi, you look well. I just wanted to see the kids." She nodded, pointed toward the living room where their laughter echoed, then returned to the kitchen where beans simmered in a pot. Martin sat quietly, unsure whether to speak or listen. The children ran to him, hugged him, then returned to their cartoons without begging him to stay. The house no longer bent toward his return. It stood firm, as if reminding him he was now a visitor in a story he helped distort. When dinner was ready, Evelyn served the children, then walked past Martin and placed her dish on the table. "There's enough in the pot," she said, not out of spite, but out of practiced neutrality. He ate quietly, the taste of humility laced in every spoonful. That night, he asked, "Can we talk?" She looked at him long and slow, then whispered, "I'm listening, but I'm not waiting." The next morning, Martin woke up in his old room, now reorganized. Evelyn had cleared half the wardrobe, boxed some of his things, and labeled them neatly. He stared at the boxes for a long time, the weight of her decision finally pressing down like wet clay on his chest. He moved through the house like someone unsure of his welcome. When he reached for the remote, his son took it and said, "Mummy says we should limit TV this week." Martin nodded. The authority had shifted. The crown no longer sat on his head. It had been melted down into bricks that Evelyn used to rebuild her sense of self. He tried to make small talk, offered to pick up groceries, fix the leaking tap, things he had long abandoned. Evelyn let him. But every thank you was measured, every smile brief, every glance wrapped in cautious distance. He was now a man learning how to apply for re-entry into a kingdom he had once ruled with neglect. The truth was clear. Evelyn was no longer seeking a partner. She had become her own anchor, her own shore. And Martin, for all his late efforts, was learning that sometimes, when a woman finally chooses herself, no apology is loud enough to rewind the silence she survived with. The day Martin stood outside the gate with 2 small bags, unsure whether to knock or walk away, the sky mirrored his confusion. The clouds above Rowfield sat still, as if holding their breath, unwilling to fall or clear. In his hand was a faded envelope, inside, a letter he had written with trembling hands, lines of apology running like spilled ink on sincerity. But letters don't walk themselves to redemption. They need a heart ready to receive them. He stared at the compound, now freshly painted in soft beige, with potted flowers that hadn't been there before. Even the sound of the children playing inside felt different, lighter, louder, rooted in joy he hadn't contributed to. Evelyn's laughter floated briefly into the air, not aimed at him, not reacting to him, just existing, and that pierced deeper than any insult could. For the first time in years, Martin understood what it meant to be outside of something you once took for granted. When he finally walked in, Evelyn met him halfway, not with arms wide open, but with her hands folded and expression calm. He held out the letter. She took it without a word and placed it on the table without opening it. "You can sit," she said softly, "but don't expect the clock to turn back." They spoke slowly that evening, not with fire or bitterness, but with the ache of people who had shared a roof, yet lived in different seasons. Martin poured out his guilt, not because he wanted pity, but because the silence was heavy enough to crush what little remained of his pride. He confessed to all the years he watched her carry weight alone, while he convinced himself he was providing emotional support. Evelyn listened, not interrupting once. Her eyes, once always searching for understanding, now simply observed, absorbing words like a wall that no longer echoed. When he was done, she said, "I used to dream of this conversation. Now I just hope you mean it." There were no tears. Her river had run dry long before the apology came. She didn't list the times she begged for help or recount every bill she paid from the depths of sacrifice. Those memories now slept peacefully in her journal, not her mouth. Instead, she asked him one question: "What made you stop trying?" Martin hesitated. Then he whispered, "Because you never failed. You always saved us." She nodded slowly, a small, sad smile crawling onto her lips. That was never a compliment. That was the problem. That night, they slept in separate rooms, him on the couch, her in the room she had reclaimed not just with curtains and bed sheets, but with new boundaries stitched with self-respect. The weeks that followed were like walking on the shoreline, uncertain footing, sometimes wet with hope, sometimes dry with discomfort. Martin didn't try to reclaim his space immediately. He started with the little things, buying groceries without being told, fixing the leaking tap without waiting to be begged, picking the children from school even when Evelyn hadn't asked. She noticed, but she said little. Progress, to her, was not in grand gestures, but in sustained consistency. It wasn't about him being sorry, it was about him being different. Her heart had grown cautious, like a flower that bloomed only when the wind was right. And Martin, for the first time, respected that pace. He took up a small role as a logistics assistant in a local construction firm, not glamorous, but honest work. When he brought home his first paycheck in months and handed it to Evelyn, she looked at it, then placed it on the kitchen counter. "Use it to buy something the kids need," she said. "You're still their father." It wasn't approval. It was a reminder. Redemption doesn't come wrapped in currency. It comes wrapped in consistency. The home began to breathe again, not because Martin had returned, but because Evelyn had redrawn the map of how she allowed herself to be loved. And now there was no room for shortcuts. By the start of the new school term, Evelyn had moved Martin's things into the guest room permanently, not out of malice, but because intimacy could no longer be defaulted back into. One morning, as she zipped up her daughter's school bag, Amira asked innocently, "Mummy, is Daddy staying with us now?" Evelyn smiled gently and replied, "He's here to learn how to be part of the team again." Martin, who overheard from the hallway, felt the weight of truth in those words. He was no longer captain. He was now a trainee learning how to coexist in a space he had once ruled by absence. The irony stung, but it was deserved. Evelyn never wore her scars like medals. She wore them like reminders. She had grown, not just out of survival, but out of intention. The house was now filled with new sounds, morning affirmations, laughter over breakfast, music from the Bluetooth speakers she bought for herself. Martin sat sometimes in the corner, just watching. Not interfering, just present. The healing wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in that imperfect beauty, Evelyn found something better than revenge, peace that didn't beg to be understood. As the sun set that evening and the children danced in the compound, she leaned against the doorway, arms folded, heart steady. She had paid every price in full, and now the receipt was hers alone to keep. Sometimes love whispers through service, but when one person begins to carry what two should bear, love becomes labor. In relationships, contribution is not a favor. It's a shared responsibility. If someone constantly withdraws from your strength without ever depositing support, eventually even your heart begins to overdraft. Learn to set boundaries not out of bitterness, but from a place of self-respect. A peaceful woman is not always a quiet woman. Sometimes She's just a woman who has stopped funding dysfunction. You are not selfish for choosing to breathe in a space where you're no longer being choked. May we all learn that the weight of love must be balanced, not dumped. Dear Lord, for every listener whose hands have grown tired from carrying more than they should, breathe new strength into them. Heal the hearts of those who have given without being thanked, who have stayed without being seen, who have paid every bill yet received emotional debt in return. Teach them that love is not proven by how much pain they can endure, but by how much peace they are willing to preserve. Restore what was lost in silent sacrifice. Rebuild every broken bond that's still worth holding. And for those choosing themselves for the first time, give them courage to walk boldly toward their healing. Let your peace be their reward. Let your wisdom be their compass. And when they finally say amen, let it be the sound of freedom echoing through every room they once wept in. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.